Hello there, welcome to Coffee Chat. I'm just going to drink some coffee. Today we're going to be talking about Gary Moore, great late Gary Moore, and especially in particular a band that he was in called BBM, because maybe a few sort of younger guys that watch this channel may not have heard of BBM. So we're just going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk about Gary Moore himself and sort of an influence he's had on my style and an influence he could have kind of on your style if you haven't really checked Gary's playing out. Interestingly, around the sort of 90s, Gary was actually really big. Gary Moore was a very successful artist. He'd had kind of a career obviously with Skid Row. He started out with Skid Row, and with Phil Lynott he was in Thin Lizzy a couple of times to replace some guitar players who were sick or recovering in recovery, and then he actually joined and made an album with Thin Lizzy, and then kind of embarked on a solo career doing many sort of heavy rock albums, which were quite successful, and a lot of people, he had a lot of fans. And then he bought a couple of, he managed to get hold of a couple of bursts, like I think he had two 1959 Les Pauls. One of them of course was the famous Peter Green's Les Paul, which, and again we're going to do a video all about that guitar and the legacy of that guitar pretty soon. But in the meantime, let's just say that he got hold of the Peter Green Les Paul, and we won't go into details on this video. He had another Les Paul called Stripe, and again we're going to go into all of this stuff in future videos. But anyway, suffice to say, he released two albums, After Hours and Still Got the Blues, and this is just from my memory. I'm not even researching this for this video, guys. But you know, he was so big around that time. He was really big. He did another album called Blues for Greenie, which was a kind of tribute to Peter Green, and he obviously played the. I'm holding this up. This is not the Peter Green Les Paul, but he did it on the Les Paul and on the Greenie Les Paul, and yeah, it was a really successful album. I remember walking into Liverpool Street Station and seeing on a huge billboard Blues for Greenie. That's how big Gary Moore was at the time in Europe, especially. Maybe not so much in America, but certainly in Europe. But anyway, I digress. Let's go back to 1993, and basically what happened was Jack Bruce was doing a gig out in Germany. I think it was his 50th birthday party, and he had a guitar player, a young gun called Blue Saraceno. And Blue Saraceno was a great sort of cool hit, young sort of at the time, especially in the late 80s, sort of metal guitar player, with the Floyd Rose, Whammy Bar, whatever. And he got a gig with Poison, so he let Jack Bruce down on the last gig of Jack Bruce's tour. And this particular gig was very important because it was his birthday party. So he invited Ginger Baker and I think Pete Brown, the writer of some of the Cream songs, co-writer, came and sang a tune with him, and Gary Moore turned up. And so you had Gary Moore, Ginger Baker, Cream's drummer, and Cream's bass player and singer, Jack Bruce, all together on a concert. And so Gary Moore had the bright idea to kind of put a band together playing sort of Cream-esque music. And so I think it was really Gary Moore that was kind of driving this ensemble. Ginger Baker was kind of along for the ride, really. I don't know if anybody's watched the documentary about Ginger Baker, but it's a must-see to understand his character. And he's very much sort of you could probably meet somebody like Ginger Baker in London, and a lot of guys like Ginger Baker in London in the 60s, and he sort of never changed really. His humour and the way he kind of portrays himself is fantastic. And I think some people see Ginger as somebody that would insult you, but if you kind of understand his character, you know, he is what he is, and he's totally unfiltered, uncensored, and obviously in this day and age of saying the right thing at the right time. And you know, actually Ginger Baker did some amazing things, going down to Africa, meeting Fela Kuti. You know, he was a pioneer, you know, and I have a good friend, well I say good friend, but a friend who plays, he's a Ghanaian percussionist who plays with Ginger Baker, and you know, he's a great guy. You know, behind the scenes he's a great guy. Also, Ginger Baker's working with another friend of mine called Pee Wee Ellis, who's a famous sax player for James Brown. And again, you know, he's a character. You know, I remember asking Pee Wee, what do you think of Ginger Baker, playing with him? And he was just like, hey man, it's crazy. So, you know, it is what it is, but he's certainly a character. And so you can imagine the history of Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker together forming this band, BBM, was going to be trouble from the start. Most of the songs were composed by Gary Moore, and and Jack Bruce with the help of some other writers. Ginger Baker managed to get on one song with Moore and Bruce. So I guess, there you go, Baker's not going to be sort of happy, he's not getting publishing money because he's only on, he's got 1/3 of one song, So that's going to be the first thing he's thinking about is, hey, these guys are earning more money from publishing. And the songs were pretty good, some of the, I think when it worked, especially the song City of Gold, which I'm going to play you a little bit now. I think it was a really cool song, had a really cool riff. And I'm just going to play some Gary Moore-esque playing. Of course, this is, you guys can probably do it a lot better than me, but here we go. Okay, so that's just kind of like a taste of the style. Gary was kind of really playing high octane blues rock, and you might have heard that kind of style with some more modern players around the scene now. And really, that kind of really fast blues with some kind of technique really was pioneered by guys like Gary Moore. Obviously, Rory Gallagher. We're going to talk about him in another video, but he's in a whole other world. That we're really going to bring in, and in fact very, very soon there's going to be a really cool video on Rory Gallagher. Anyway, let's get back to BBM. So BBM, they formed around 93, 94. They produced a pretty good album, and it was actually reviewed in England by publications such as The Telegraph and The Guardian. So people took this really seriously as a kind of a new version of Cream. And this is when the big sort of bands like Dire Straits were finishing. And you had obviously Pearl Jam and the Nirvanas and all the Guns N' Roses coming out, and then you had this really cool kind of band. You got the bass player and the drummer of Cream, with an amazing guitar player. So it was a big thing in the guitar world. It was a really, we were all excited. I remember going into my local record store and buying the CD as soon as it came out, and just loving it. And just the first song, City of Gold, just with Ginger Baker. The first thing you listen to is the kind of the Jack Bruce's bass lines. And this kind of Cream sort of Crossroads style song with this great backbeat from Ginger Baker. And Ginger Baker doesn't normally play a backbeat. He's very versed in African and polyrhythmic styles, and obviously he's a jazz drummer. He's an old school jazz, London jazz drummer. So you had that cool sound with his tom playing, and it was really, really good. And so maybe some of the songs were a little bit kind of like Gary Moore's second solo sort of blues solo album, After Hours. And they didn't work so well, in my opinion. Songs like High Cost of Loving, those kind of songs. But my favourite song, which I still listen to on a regular basis, is Where in the World. And that's a beautiful song which kind of modulates between a few keys, and I think it ends in a beautiful solo in C major. And so Gary's playing these beautiful licks. It's just a really cool, and it's got a nice kind of uni-vibe or chorus sort of guitar on it. It's a great song, and it's a nice collaboration between Jack Bruce's voice and Gary Moore's voice. It's probably one of my all-time favourite songs, actually. So check that one out. Check that song out. It's called Where in the World. And then this band did a few gigs. They did some gigs in Spain. They did some Barrowlands in Scotland, in the UK tour. And the problems were arising, not least because of the sound levels. And mainly that's because imagine Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker being on that 2-year tour, 2.5 year sort of ride with Cream. Sorry, it wasn't a 2-year course. I mean, the band were together for 2 years, I think 2.5 years, but they spent a lot of time touring. And back in the Cream days, in the late 60s, the PAs were non-existent, really. They were just used for drums and vocals, and the bass and the guitar sounds had to come from massive amps, columns of Marshalls. So you can imagine that, Eric, Jack and Ginger's hearing is not the best in the world. So obviously Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce are playing very, very loud, and bass amps nowadays, in the 90s, they could get really loud, clean. Trace Elliott and Marshall amps were really good. And Jack Bruce was kind of playing, I think he was playing an EB1 which was like an even earlier version of the EB2 bass I think they played. Tell me if I'm wrong here. It's all from my head, so I might have got some things wrong, but yeah, that was the main issue. That was the number one issue with the band, was the sound levels. So I'm going to read you some quotes from Ginger Baker about about his work with the project, because it's pretty revealing, if not only from Ginger Baker's side. So Ginger says, "The sessions we did delighted everyone," Ginger recalls, "even though Bruce was acting like my boss again and treating me like a session player. A tour was suggested and that I'd get £50,000 per gig. What I didn't realise was that Gary Moore was playing so loud that he blew his ears, just as Jack had done to me. More gigs were cancelled than played, and they were awful anyway. Unlike Cream, everything with Gary Moore was contrived. Every solo he played was the same, and I like to improvise. Unbeknownst to me, they organised a rehearsal at Brixton Academy, and when I got there, I could hear Gary Moore's guitar outside on the street. We played it note perfect, as usual, should have been the effing gig. The next day, his manager phones me and says Gary's blown his ears again, and they've taken him to the doctor. So I said, why don't you take him to the effing psychiatrist? Because that's what he needs. That wasn't the right thing to say to Mr. God Almighty." So Ginger continues in his rage and then says, "That was a terrible time playing with the pampered pompadour of pop. One gig was cancelled when Gary cut his finger opening a tin. Eric would have put a plaster on and played, but not Gary. And again, it was so loud, I had to have baffle boards on either side. I hate volume. Why does rock music have to be so loud? That was rock and roll finished for me." Another point worth mentioning was the album cover, because the album cover featured Ginger Baker on the front with these two sort of wings. And this was kind of done in the photo shoot, and it just so happened that there were some angel wings in the photo studio, and they put them on for a laugh. Ginger Baker, and he was smoking a cigarette, and this kind of angered a lot of US people, because they said, you're portraying an angel, but you're having a cigarette or a spliff hanging out your mouth. Isn't this, bad for religious reasons, So anyway, I guess Ginger Baker, thinking he's on the front of the album, because it was a really, really cool album, cover. He's probably thinking, wait a minute, I'm on the album cover. I deserve, a fair split. Maybe there were some money issues or royalty issues. So who knows what the truth of this whole thing was. But it's a real shame, because this band was actually pretty good. And you can see there's some great footage on YouTube, which I really suggest you watch, and I'm going to put it in the links. And just really, really check out, this band, because they were, the album was just really, really professional sounding. It was very, very good. It was a shame that they couldn't kind of progress and get further down the road and maybe produce another album. And in my honest opinion, I think that Gary was the best placed person to replace Eric. Obviously Eric Clapton's got a different touch, but you've got to remember Eric Clapton was actually playing Strats, and he had a different feel, a different style then. And so, Gary Moore could really turn on the sort of Cream cutting blues breaker, early Cream sort of sound with the Les Paul. And he even had a Firebird, for the photo shoot. So it just kind of looked very promising. And like I said, people really took it seriously at the time. And it's a shame that they just faded, before they even got sort of any momentum, they split up, and obviously the relationship between Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce just didn't help that. Later they were to contravene in the reformation of Cream with Eric Clapton, which was a lot more successful. Obviously anything with Eric Clapton's name attached is going to be much, much bigger. It was kind of interesting, because I always thought at the time, I wonder what Eric thinks, about this band BBM, which they've formed and they haven't got Eric in there. I just kind of wondered what Eric thought about that at the time, and I think there was some mumblings around that he wasn't happy with it, But Eric Clapton and Gary Moore, they knew each other. They definitely knew each other. There's some photos of them together at various award ceremonies, and actually Eric Clapton was playing Still Got the Blues as a tribute to Gary when Gary passed away. So I think that there was a mutual respect, and bear in mind that Gary Moore was actually friends with George Harrison. And they had a good friendship. And Gary Moore used to go and hang out at George Harrison's house, apparently. So, and obviously Eric and George were good friends, so I think there was, a mutual friendship there amongst them. So the album Around the Next Dream was released on May the 17th, 1994. The early press sort of said quotes like, they couldn't get Eric Clapton to play, so they chose Gary Moore instead. And I think that Ginger really thought that Gary wasn't at all like Eric. I mean, you know, Eric was really channeled into that kind of psychedelia music, and also really the art of improvisation. Even though it was limited with kind of the blues vocabulary, it really was out there. You know, kind of much more out there than I think Gary's playing. You know, Gary kind of falls back on a few sort of devices, I've noticed. I mean, you might argue with me here, but I think Gary's sort of got his stock kind of licks, his stock ways of doing things, and he's a very, very professional guy. And he's someone that's, you know, he's going to work within his sort of comfort zone. He's not going to stray too much. But I think, and Eric Clapton was kind of doing the same, you know, as a blues framework, but I think there was more sort of exploration between the three of them when Eric was with Cream. That's just my personal opinion, and I think that's what sort of Ginger admired in Eric's playing, was that he was, you know, he had just a certain sort of dynamic and chemistry there that maybe he didn't have with so much with Gary. Somebody who I really admire and respect, and is actually a friend of mine on Facebook, and I had probably a friend outside Facebook, who knows, but it's the Charles Shaar Murray. I'm going to read you a quote by Charles Shaar Murray, and anybody sort of familiar with it, anybody familiar with the music press in the UK will know Charles's name. But Charles says, "It was bigger, cleaner, rounder, and more defined than the often fuzzy, scuzzy, and over-compressed Cream. And he thought that Gary had out-Gibsoned and out-marshalled his illustrious predecessor." Bear in mind, at the time, 1993 was an amazing year for music, because, you know, think about all those bands, great rock bands that were around. But the album actually got to number 9, which was quite a feat, considering, you know, it wasn't with Eric Clapton, and it was, you know, kind of some has-beens, some old 60s musicians getting together. And so they did really well, and it was very, very promising. The band were rehearsing at Peter Gabriel's Real World Studios, and their first gig was at Marquee Club. And it's quite a funny story, because Jack Bruce turned up with 3 massive Marshall stacks, and Gary Moore only had a small little 50-watt combo. So you can imagine all Gary could hear was bass, you know. So the band basically nearly ended after this first gig, because it was a bit of a disaster. But they managed to get over their disagreements and get it together to do some more shows. Check out the YouTube videos of BBM in Spain. I think they were Gary's favourite gigs, and he said that the band kind of got into the real sort of Cream improvisational sort of vibe of it. I think because of Jack Bruce's and Ginger Baker's sort of past history, and the fact that they just couldn't get along together, marred with the fact that Jack Bruce was playing very, very loud. Gary Moore was cut his hand, couldn't do some gigs, and also had problems with his hearing because of the stage volume that they were playing at. You know, Gary was playing so loud to get over Jack Bruce, and Gary wasn't used to playing that loud. So I think really those were the problems that brought the band down, and it was a real shame that they couldn't get over to the US, because a US tour was never booked. So unfortunately, Americans never got to see this band. I think if they had have got over to America, it could have been something really special. They could have really rode the wave in America, because I know that Cream were a legendary. I think it would have been the right time. It would have been a really cool time for this BBM band to get over to America. And so that's sad that that didn't happen, but we still got that great album, which I really suggest you check out. Some great playing, some really good songwriting. Normally you don't get good songwriting on a blues rock sort of album, but this has some really nice songwriting, like in particular one of my favourite songs. So I suggest everybody just check that album out. It's really, really cool. Great. We've got some footage on YouTube. It's just a shame that it didn't last. So guys, hope you've enjoyed this coffee chat. It's been great, and tune in soon, and see you soon.